Good morning and welcome to this morning's reflection. Today we're going to be looking at another way in which we are formed during childhood and which determines the way in which we interact with people around us. But it's this way that we bring to God which enables Him to transform us into people who have a more constructive way of engaging with the world, a more secure way of being in the world. Sometimes we often ask unconsciously, what is wrong here? That's our first engagement with the world. What is wrong here? What is wrong with the people I am with, or the movie that I'm watching? Who is failing here? Who is not doing their job well? Where am I unsafe? Where should I not be? And it keeps the person, these questions keep a person in a posture of assessment rather than encounter. It makes it difficult for us to be open to the world around us. Others are measured and categorized and sometimes diminished. Even the self is not spared. There is often a harsh inner critic running beneath the surface. And at first glance, this type of person can look like someone who is strong. They can appear morally serious and intellectually sharp, and even spiritually awake. But underneath, there is a drivenness that is driven by anxiety and the need for control. And so judgment becomes a shield. If I can define and critique, I don't have to be vulnerable. In the spiritual life, this person or someone with this type of ego creates a subtle but powerful barrier to grace. Instead of receiving God as a gift, the person evaluates God's actions. Instead of surrender, there is always scrutiny. Prayer can become analysis. Scripture can become a tool for correction rather than transformation, and the heart remains always guarded. And this is especially significant in traditions that value truth and holiness. The critical ego can disguise itself as zeal, yet over time it tends to produce a distance from God. Because intimacy requires that we trust and not control. It tends to distance itself from others because love requires receptivity and not a place of constant evaluation. And it produces an inner dryness because grace cannot be earned through judgment. And so spiritually, this type of ego resists the movement from law to love, from control to surrender, and from certainty to trust. In the Bible, the most obvious example of people having such an ego or such a relationship with the world around them would be the Pharisees. They're not villains in a simplistic sense. They're deeply committed to holiness and faithfulness. Yet in many of the gospel encounters, their defining posture is critical and evaluative. They watch Jesus closely, not to receive, but to assess him. They question his healing, his table fellowship, his interpretation of the law. Their ego is structured around knowing, defining, and guarding boundaries. What they struggle with is not knowledge, but receptivity. They cannot easily recognize God when He does not fit their image. Another example would be the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son. And the elder brother here embodies a quieter but equally powerful version of this ego. He is dutiful, obedient, and he is morally upright. Yet when grace is extended to the younger brother, his response is judgment and resentment. His identity is built on comparison and fairness. He cannot rejoice because he is so busy measuring. And his critical stance isolates him, not just from his brother, but from his father's joy. Jonah is another example. Jonah resists God's mercy towards Nineveh, and he reveals his deeply judgmental interior. He knows what is right, and he cannot accept that God's compassion extends beyond his own moral framework. And even after Nineveh repents, Jonah remains outside, critical and displeased. His ego cannot yet align with the wideness of God's mercy. It would be a mistake to try to eliminate this ego entirely. The capacity to discern and to recognize truth and falsehood is good. The problem is not judgment itself, but where it is rooted. The invitation of the spiritual life is not to abandon discernment, but to let it be transformed by love. And so this means we have to move from judging to understanding, from defining others to receiving them just as they are, and from protecting ourselves to trusting God. In the Gospels, there's always this movement. The movement of Christ is always towards those who are open, not those who are certain. And this defining or critical ego is slowly softened not by argument, but by encounter, by experiencing grace that cannot be controlled or earned. There is often a quiet fear underneath any judgment, because we fear that if we stop analyzing and we stop deciding who is right and who is wrong, we will be unsafe. Lecturing others never works, but rather there is always to be held an invitation and a reminder that you and those around you are held. You don't need to defend yourself. That you and those around you are loved. You don't need to evaluate others. And in that safety, the ego can begin to loosen its grip, not collapsing into a kind of indifference, but opening into something deeper, a self that can see clearly and love generously. And it is in this place of contemplative prayer that we give this critical side of ourselves to God.